You won't believe what happened to oil prices after OPEC announced another series of production cuts, extending them even further into 2024. To really appreciate the significance, I think we should go back and revisit the 2008 oil price bubble, spike, whatever you want to call it, to understand, to really unpack the fundamentals behind oil, as well as the real economy in circumstances that are very familiar to what we're experiencing today. When we do so, we'll be able to put together a better intuitive map or a model for the economy as it moves forward in 2024, including consumer prices and how they're really behaving. And we got the consumer price index number in the United States for the month of February. So to start with, let's revisit where we are with oil today. As of a little while ago, oil prices, the front month WTI contract of April 2024 was at 78.50 or thereabouts. The May contract was 78.09, and July, which is the 3-month spread, 77.21. What you realize with the oil price curve or the oil price market is that oil prices themselves have been largely stable going back to the middle of February. Not only that, as prices have been stable, the curve has changed pretty dramatically. It had steepened out into massive amounts of backwardation. In fact, by the beginning of March, just a couple weeks ago, not even a couple weeks ago, the 1-month calendar spread had been 88 cents into backwardation, which is pretty steep, and the 3-month spread had been 238 into backwardation. However, since March 1st, the curve has flattened out rather dramatically. In fact, the 1-month spread as of today down to 40 cents or less than half of what it was on March 1st, while the 3-month spread was $1.22, still in backwardation, but half the backwardation of what it was just 11 days ago. And in between, this is the funny part, OPEC announced they were extending their production cuts. Now, there wasn't a whole lot of surprise to that. It had been whispered and rumored about before then, but still, OPEC said the Secretariat noted the announcements of several OPEC Plus countries extending additional voluntary cuts of 2.2 million barrels per day, aimed at supporting the stability and balance of the oil markets. And this was led by the Saudis, Iraq, Kuwait, and the UAE, basically all our Middle Eastern friends. But 2.2 million barrels per day extended throughout the second quarter, on top of all the production cuts and supply restrictions that go way back to really late 2022. And at best, oil prices go sideways and backwardation is coming more and more off. The curve is flattening. What must be happening in terms of demand? Because when we think about what determines oil prices, it's oil prices that are determined by demand, not demand determined by oil prices. So let's go back to the middle 2000s. The middle 2000s, oil prices were rising rather precipitously. And of course, it was a topic of conversation, not just because of the cost of the economy, but also in terms of Federal Reserve policymakers, this was contributing to inflation. In late 2004, Bernanke, then governor of the Federal Reserve, was asked about, hey, how do you determine oil prices? Because oil's starting to rise here, and that looks like it's going to get pretty uncomfortable. And Bernanke said, what accounts for the behavior of the current and expected future price of oil? The writer George Bernard Shaw once said that to obtain an economist, it was only necessary to teach a parrot to repeat endlessly the phrase supply and demand. Well, as an economist, Bernanke said, I have to agree with the parrot. For the most part, high oil prices reflect high and growing demand for oil and limited or uncertain supplies. And he was absolutely right. He got that perfectly. In the middle 2000s, Saudi Arabia, mostly Saudi Arabia, had been for a long time the global oil supply shock absorber. Whenever oil demand had been too weak, for example, and oil prices started to fall, Saudi Arabia would remove supply from the global system and therefore steady prices. They also, when oil demand got to be really big, they would supply additional crude to absorb that increase in demand and therefore keep prices stable. By the middle 2000s, however, Saudi Arabia was no longer able to do that because their production had largely stagnated, as did much of the rest of the world, while at the same time, demand for crude around the world, especially emerging markets, and most of all from China, was rising precipitously. But why is demand? What is it that determines demand? Well, let's ask an economist by the name of James D. Hamilton from the University of California, San Diego, who wrote a paper called Causes and Consequences of the Oil Shock of 2007 2008 for Brookings Institute. And I think it really good paper, really good study, and really good evidence. And what he found was the single most important fact for understanding short run changes in the price of oil is that income rather than price is the key determinant of the quantity demanded. One quick way to become convinced of this fact is to examine Figure 2, which I'm showing you here, which is essentially a scatter plot of U.S. petroleum consumption against GDP over the last 60 years, with successive years connected by a smooth curve. Tracing this curve from lower left to upper right thus tracks the realized combinations of real GDP and petroleum consumption as they changed over time. And this only makes perfect sense. Energy is, in fact, one of the most important inputs to any wealthy and industrialized society. Therefore, as any economy becomes more wealthy and more industrialized, that wealth and industrialization, that increase in economic output and expansion, is what drives consumption of energy, regardless of price, or almost regardless of price. So if prices of oil go up, demand won't necessarily change all that much. It takes a lot for prices to change demand. Conversely, it takes a lot for demand to be changed in order to lead to a situation where it affects the price of oil. That's the important part we're going to get to here. Continuing with Hamilton, the price elasticity of petroleum demand has always been small, and it's hard to avoid any conclusion other than it became smaller in the United States in the 2000s. One can barely detect any downward deviation from the trend in petroleum consumption in Figure 2 for that period, despite the enormous price increase through 2007. So it's not price increases necessarily that reduce demand. Demand goes down because the economy goes down. And 2008 was a perfect example of all of these factors combining at one single time in one single bubbly point. We have to remember that not only was Chinese demand rising precipitously through the middle 2000s, we also had, in addition to Saudi Arabia's supply, there are also supply problems in the year 2008 that contributed a lot to the oil price surging up to its ultimate high of around $145 per barrel in the United States, WTI. Among those were a number of individual smaller supply shocks that kept taking more and more oil off of the market, making it less and less available, as demand was, at that time, just basically softening. It wasn't falling off, it wasn't falling apart by any means. In the first half of the Great Recession, demand was just softening. At the same time, supply was being heavily restricted. And here's just a partial list in early 2008. In February 2008, Venezuela, they cut off ExxonMobil from some of its oil field production and properties there because they were nationalizing things. Iraqi oil fields. In March of 2008, saboteurs blew up 2 oil pipelines in the south, cutting about 300,000 barrels per day. April 25th, 2008, unionized Nigerian oil workers went on strike. Again, ExxonMobil, 780,000 barrels per day. April 27th, Scottish oil workers go on strike. That closed the North Forties pipeline, which carried half of the UK's North Sea oil production. May 1st, about 1.4 million barrels per day. Again, Nigeria, a combination of militant attacks, labor strikes, sabotage, all that stuff. Mexico, in May of 2008, had a big problem with declining production at one of its biggest oil fields. June of 2008, again, Nigeria, this time for Shell oil, 225,000 barrels per day. And then, again, Nigeria, another pipeline for Chevron, shut down to 125,000 barrels per day. And when you add all those up, it's about 2.2 million barrels per day are no longer available to global supply. So demand is relatively constant because the economy hasn't actually fallen off that much by that point. Supply gets reduced and the price absolutely surges because the supply reduction was substantial and demand at that point was still growing at a substantial rate, especially overseas. The situation that we have in 2024, really from 2023 into 2024, is different, but it's almost a mirror image of all of these factors from 2008, starting with supply. Now, supply is exactly the same, about 2.2 million barrels per day, at least in the latest OPEC announcement. And though that applies to quotas, there is still a substantial reduction in actual barrels produced. It isn't just the fact that OPEC will promises not to catch up on all of the country's quotas that may be behind. Essentially, there is a real reduction in supply here. And either way, the market knows that it's never going to get caught back up on supply for those members who are actually behind on their quotas. So we have a substantial reduction in supply, but unlike 2008, rather than seeing the price go skyrocketing, now we have a substantial reduction in supply that leaves the price basically stable, which can only mean that demand is the one that has really changed. If price has gone way up in 2008 but stable in 2024, and supply is basically the same, restricted in both cases, demand must have fallen off. And demand has fallen off not necessarily because the price has been high and stable at a high price. Demand has fallen off because the primary determinant of demand for oil is national income, not just in the US, but around the rest of the world. National income falling means recession. Countries around the world are experiencing a decline in economic circumstances, which is leading to a substantial enough decline in oil demand that even a 2.2 million barrel production cut isn't enough to raise oil prices. In fact, it's not even enough to keep the WTI futures curve in steep backwardation. That is the important point and the important lesson from 2008. As bad as it was, the imbalance in 2008, we have the flip side of it here, where demand was constant, led to prices surging. Demand is falling, which is leading prices to be stable, while everyone is picturing the supply side as the sole determinant of demand, or sole determinant of prices here. We were reminded about the really weak state of global demand for crude oil and really global demand in general last week when the Chinese reported on their exports and imports for the months of January and February. They combined them because of the Golden Week and the calendar skews that happened there. Imports of oil into China, especially in volume terms, has been increasingly weak over really the last 6 months or so. China sort of caught up from the pandemic period and zero COVID and all of that in the middle part of last year as the country reopened. After purchasing a bunch of oil and importing it, they stopped doing so. And now the level of imports, especially the 6-month average where you can really see it well, has been declining rather precipitously, which goes along with exactly what OPEC is doing by cutting back on supply to better match demand that is falling off. And oil demand is falling off because, as Hamilton told us 15 years ago, it's all about national incomes. So we have to ask this question, especially in light of the consumer price numbers in the United States today. How does the economy look if it wasn't for the supply restrictions? If it wasn't for OPEC's actions, if it wasn't for Saudi Arabia, what would the price of oil be? The price of oil wouldn't be in the high 70s, I guarantee you that. It might not even be in the high 60s. I bet it would be in the 50s or even lower. What would the consumer price numbers be if oil prices were reflecting actual economic circumstances on the demand side? With oil down in the 50s, CPIs would be much less. And not only would we not be talking about inflation, we would be more the recession that's taking place that's really restricting demand, leading to less demand in the economy as well as for oil. That would be far clearer than it is today. Instead of people talking about inflation driven by oil prices, they would be talking about the recession and deflation that is reflecting in oil prices. That's where we would be. But even looking at the consumer price numbers in the United States for the month of February, they were driven largely by two factors. As the BLS itself noted, those two factors were gasoline and, of course, shelter or rents. As the BLS said, those two indexes contributed over 60% of the monthly increase in the index for all items. 60% of a 0.44% month-over-month change, which was faster than last month's 0.31 when everybody was shocked about the 0.31%, which was entirely rent. The only difference here is that rents decelerated a little bit, while gasoline turned around and increased. But again, what would gasoline actually be in an environment where oil prices were reflecting actual underlying fundamentals? Gasoline would be even lower. And to show you what I mean, look at the contributions to the CPI over the last 7 months going back to last July. So ever since oil prices surged when the initial Saudi Arabia announcement and OPEC and everything last summer, going back to last July, so I got August forward through February 2024, over those 7 months, the CPI rose at a 2.6% annual rate, which isn't all that much, but it's still higher than the Fed would like, although that's close to the PCE deflator being around 2%, but still 2.6% annual rate during that 7-month period. And that includes a 0.6 of a point subtraction from gasoline, because gasoline, reflecting somewhat the weak demand fundamentals in the United States, gasoline prices are actually lower despite the increase in February. You have a 2.6% annual rate that includes a 0.6 point subtraction from gasoline and 1.8 point addition from shelter, including 1.5 points from IOR alone. So almost the entirety of the CPI, and really the core CPI, which is 2.7% annual rate over the same period, is all about shelter. And gasoline prices, which already subtracted 0.6 of a percentage point to help out that comparison, would have subtracted about another 0.6 of a percentage point if oil prices were down in, say, the 50s, according to my rough back of the envelope calculations. So the CPI, including 1.8 points of artificial shelter rent, would be around 2% already, which means the rest of the CPI, including gasoline, would have amounted to just 0.2 percentage points. There's basically nothing in the CPI except artificial gasoline, which is supported by the non-economic factors of supply, along with shelter imputations. So you look at the state of the oil market. OPEC just extended its production cuts, no surprise, but still a substantial production cut extension. And oil prices do absolutely nothing. And they do nothing because demand is weak. And demand is weak because, as we saw in 2008, it's all about national incomes. As demand declines in the real economy, that means the demand for oil goes down regardless of price. And it's up to Saudi Arabia and OPEC to try to stabilize prices through these artificial means, which only goes to reinforce just how weak demand must be in the real economy, because it took a substantial supply reduction just to keep prices stable. And as far as consumer prices go, they would be even weaker, to the point that we would be talking about recession. Not only would oil prices be down, but CPIs would be down a lot more too. So because of the focus on supply and the reality of supply restrictions, we don't appreciate just how much and how weak demand has become all across the global economy, US included, because after the last labor market numbers, especially the household survey and its 3 recession signals, that looks a lot like oil prices would be if not for all of this supply stuff. I mentioned 3 recession signals in the payroll numbers. It wasn't really a payroll number, it was a household survey. What were those 3 signals? That's the video I've got linked below. As always, I thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. Until next time, take care.